Welcome back to Revenge Room. I'm so glad you're here with me today. If you're new to this channel, this is the place where we share real stories of betrayal, disrespect, and the quiet, powerful moments when dignity fights back. These aren't stories about revenge through anger. They're stories about people who were underestimated, humiliated, and pushed too far, and then rose to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Today's story is one that will stay with you long after it ends. It's called, "At a family dinner, my daughter-in-law snatched my watch and mocked, 'It's just a fake.' Then..." Now let me tell you something before we begin. This story has twists you won't see coming. There's a secret hidden inside an old pocket watch. There's a woman who turned out to be far more dangerous than anyone imagined. And there's a wife who protected her husband from beyond the grave. If you stay until this very end, I promise you this, you will feel every emotion from heartbreak to triumph, and you will witness one of the most complete forms of justice I have ever shared on this channel. So settle in, turn up the volume, and let's begin. The moment satisfies me still even now, months later. Not the revenge itself, but the silence right before it. That perfect, terrible silence when my daughter-in-law realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. It started at a family dinner. My late wife gave me a pocket watch on our 30th anniversary. She held my hands, looked into my eyes, and said, "This watch will protect you when I no longer can." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. That night, my daughter-in-law grabbed it from my hands, laughed, and said, "This old thing, it's probably worth less than my watch strap." She scratched the face. She broke the clasp. My son, my own flesh and blood, just shrugged and said, "Forget it, Dad. I'll buy you another one at a flea market." They laughed together while I sat in silence. But here's what they didn't know. They didn't know my wife had seen this coming, years before she died. They didn't know what was hidden inside that watch. They didn't know I was already 3 steps ahead. And they certainly didn't know that by morning, 60 missed calls would be just the beginning of their nightmare. This is my story. My name is Richard Lawson. I am 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges and skyscrapers across Colorado. 2 years ago, I lost Eleanor, my wife of 43 years, to cancer. Since then, I have lived alone in the cabin we built together in the mountains, surrounded by her memory and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. I thought the hardest chapter of my life was behind me. I was wrong. The dinner started the way most family dinners do, with forced smiles and small talk that meant nothing. I had prepared a simple meal, roast chicken with vegetables from my garden, the same recipe Eleanor used to make for Sunday gatherings. My son Daniel arrived with his wife Lydia around 6 in the evening. He looked tired, the kind of tired that settles into a man's bones when he has stopped fighting for himself. Lydia, on the other hand, looked like she had just stepped out of a magazine. Her hair was perfect, her nails were perfect, her smile was perfect, and her eyes were calculating every object in my home as if she were appraising it for auction. From the moment they walked through the door, Lydia dominated the conversation. She talked about their vacation plans, their new furniture, their busy social calendar. Daniel nodded along like a passenger in his own life. When I asked him directly about his work, Lydia answered for him. "Oh, Daniel's doing fine. You know how demanding his job is. He doesn't like to talk about it." Daniel just shrugged and reached for more bread. I watched my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had put through college, and I barely recognized him. He had become a shadow, standing behind his wife's spotlight. Halfway through dinner, Lydia noticed my pocket watch sitting on the side table. I had taken it off while cooking and forgotten to put it back on. She picked it up without asking, turning it over in her hands like a trinket she had found at a garage sale. "What's this old thing?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. "It looks ancient. Probably worth less than my watch strap." She laughed at her own joke, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. I kept my voice calm. "Eleanor gave me that watch on our 30th anniversary. It's an antique 19th century. She said it would protect me when she no longer could." Lydia rolled her eyes. "That's sweet, I suppose. Sentimental nonsense, but sweet." She fumbled with the clasp, trying to open it, and I heard a small crack. She had scratched the face and damaged the clasp in the same careless motion. "Oops," she said, not sounding sorry at all. She set the watch down on the table like it was garbage. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He glanced at the watch, then at me, and shrugged again. "It's just a watch, Dad. I'll buy you another one at a flea market or something." Then he laughed, following his wife's lead like a trained dog. The silence that followed was mine. I chose it deliberately. I picked up the watch, examined the scratch across its face, and said nothing. 43 years of marriage, 43 years of love, sacrifice, and partnership, and my own son thought it could be replaced with a flea market trinket. Later, over coffee, Lydia steered the conversation toward finances. "Richard, have you thought about your future? Planning ahead?" Daniel and I were discussing how important it is for families to have clear arrangements, just in case something happens. She smiled warmly, but her eyes were cold. We wouldn't want any confusion down the line. I asked Daniel a simple question about his mortgage. Lydia answered before he could open his mouth. "We refinanced recently. Home improvements. You know how expensive everything is these days." I nodded, but I noticed Daniel look away. There had been no home improvements. I had visited their house last month. Nothing had changed. By the time they left, the evening air was cool, and the stars were beginning to appear over the mountains. Daniel gave me a brief hug at the door. Lydia waved from the car without getting out. I stood on the porch and watched their taillights disappear down the winding road. Then I went back inside, picked up Eleanor's watch, and held it in my palm. The scratch caught the light, a permanent scar from a careless hand. I tucked it into my breast pocket, the place closest to my heart, and said nothing to the empty room. But my eyes had recorded everything, and somewhere deep inside me, a decision had already begun to form. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the pine trees outside my window. The cabin felt emptier than usual, as if the evening's events had drained something vital from its walls. Around midnight, I gave up trying to rest and walked to the living room. The pocket watch sat on the side table where I had left it, catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains. I picked it up and settled into my armchair, the same chair where Eleanor used to sit and read her mystery novels on quiet evenings. Holding the watch brought her back to me in fragments. The way she laughed when I told bad jokes, the way she hummed while cooking breakfast, the way she looked at me on our 30th anniversary, her eyes bright with something I could not quite name. We had celebrated that milestone at a small restaurant overlooking the river, just the two of us. No fanfare, no crowd. Eleanor never liked extravagance. She believed in substance over show, in meaning over spectacle. After dinner, she had reached across the table and placed a small velvet box in my hands. "Open it," she said, her voice soft but serious. Inside was this pocket watch. I recognized it immediately as an antique 19th century craftsmanship, the kind of piece that collectors fought over at auctions. The case was gold worn smooth by generations of hands, and the face was ivory with delicate Roman numerals. I was overwhelmed. We had never exchanged gifts this valuable before. "Eleanor, this must have cost a fortune," I said. She shook her head. "It belonged to my grandfather. He gave it to my grandmother on their wedding day. She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me. Now it belongs to you." I tried to protest, to say that such a family heirloom should stay with her, but she stopped me with a gentle hand on my wrist. "Richard, listen to me carefully. This watch is more than a keepsake. If anything ever happens to me, look inside this watch. Promise me." I promised, of course. I would have promised her anything. But I didn't take her words literally. I assumed she meant the watch itself was a reminder of our love, a symbol of the life we had built together. I never imagined she meant something physical, something hidden. The watch had a back compartment, a feature common in antique timepieces of that era. Watchmakers in the 19th century often included small hidden spaces behind the face, originally designed to hold photographs of loved ones or locks of hair. I knew the compartment existed, but I never opened it. It felt like an invasion of something sacred, like reading someone's diary without permission. Eleanor was still alive then. I did not need to search for hidden messages. Now, sitting alone in the dark, I wondered if I had been foolish. Eleanor was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and one of the things that occasionally frustrated me. She had worked as a bank manager for nearly 30 years before retiring. She understood money in ways that I, with my engineering brain, never fully grasped. She knew about trusts, asset protection, investment strategies, and financial fraud. She could spot a scam from a mile away and had saved more than one friend from making disastrous decisions with their savings. When she spoke about finances, people listened. Even the lawyers listened. That thought led me to another memory. About 5 years before she died, Eleanor had insisted that we hire a specific attorney to handle our estate planning. His name was Thomas Reed, a quiet man in his 60s with a reputation for discretion and integrity. I had suggested using a younger lawyer, someone more modern, but Eleanor refused. "Thomas Reed is the only one I trust," she said firmly. "Promise me you will never change attorneys, Richard, no matter what happens, no matter who suggests otherwise." I had promised again without fully understanding why. Eleanor rarely demanded things from me, so when she did, I paid attention. Thomas had handled our wills, our property documents, and various other legal matters over the years. After Eleanor passed, I kept him on retainer out of loyalty to her wishes. I had not spoken to him in months, but his number was still in my phone. Sitting in my armchair, I turned the watch over in my hands. The scratch Lydia had made caught the dim light, a jagged line across the ivory face. Such casual destruction, such thoughtless cruelty, and my son had laughed along as if his mother's memory meant nothing. I thought about Eleanor's words again. "Look inside this watch. Promise me." My thumb hovered over the small latch that would open the back compartment. Part of me wanted to open it immediately to discover whatever secret Eleanor had left behind. But another part of me hesitated. Once I opened it, whatever was inside would change things. I could feel that truth in my bones. Eleanor never did anything without reason. If she had hidden something in this watch, it was important. And important things required preparation. I set the watch on my desk, running my thumb one last time over the scratched face. The night was quiet. The mountains held their breath, and I made a decision. I would open the watch, but not tonight. First, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. First, I needed to make a phone call. I still had not opened it. Not yet. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at my desk watching the mist curl through the pine trees. The pocket watch lay where I had left it, still unopened, still waiting. But my mind was clearer now. The sleepless night had burned away the initial hurt and left something harder in its place. I was not going to react with emotion. I was not going to call Daniel and demand an apology. I was not going to confront Lydia and tell her exactly what I thought of her behavior. Those responses would feel good for a moment, but they would accomplish nothing. Anger is loud, strategy is quiet. I learned that principle decades ago working on construction sites where one wrong calculation could bring down an entire structure. You do not fix a problem by shouting at it. You fix it by understanding it, measuring it, and then addressing it with precision. I found an old notebook in my desk drawer, the kind with a leather cover and lined pages that I used to carry on job sites. I opened it to the first blank page and wrote the date at the top. Then I began documenting everything I could remember from the dinner. Lydia's comments about the watch, Daniel's passive agreement, the questions about my finances disguised as concern for my future, the lie about refinancing for home improvements. I wrote down Time's direct quotes where I could recall them and my own observations about body language and tone. It felt strange at first, clinical, almost like I was investigating strangers instead of my own family. But I kept writing. If something was wrong, truly wrong, I would need evidence, not suspicions, not feelings. Facts. Around 9 o'clock, I picked up the phone and called Thomas Reed. His secretary answered and put me through immediately, which surprised me. Thomas was usually booked solid with appointments. "Richard," he said, his voice warm but measured, "I was wondering when you would call." That stopped me. "You were expecting to hear from me." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that carries weight. "Eleanor told me you would call eventually. She did not know when, but she was certain it would happen. She asked me to wait until you were ready." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Ready for what? "Eleanor updated some documents before she passed," Thomas said carefully. "Significant updates. She gave me specific instructions about when and how to discuss them with you. She said I would know the right moment because you would come to me with questions, not the other way around." My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of updates? "I think that conversation should happen in person, Richard. But I can tell you this much, your wife was thorough. She saw things others missed. She prepared for possibilities that most people would never consider." I wanted to press him for more details, to demand answers right then and there. But something held me back. Eleanor had set this up deliberately. She had trusted Thomas with information she had not shared with me, and she had done so for a reason. If I rushed in blindly, I might miss something important. Thomas, I need you to do something for me, I said. I want you to monitor all financial transactions connected to my family. Daniel, his wife, any accounts that might be linked to them or to me. Can you do that? I can, he said without hesitation. May I ask what prompted this request? I am not sure yet, I admitted. Something feels wrong. I need to know if my instincts are correct before I take any action. Understood. I will begin immediately and contact you if anything unusual appears. He paused again. Richard, I want you to know that Eleanor loved you very much. Everything she did to protect you. Remember that when the time comes. After we hung up, I sat motionless for a long while, processing what I had just heard. Eleanor had seen something, she had prepared something, and she had trusted me to figure it out when the moment arrived. I returned to my notebook and flipped to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote Daniel's name and began listing everything I knew about his financial situation. He had mentioned the refinancing casually at dinner a few months ago, claiming they needed the money for home improvements. But when I visited their house last month, nothing had changed. Same kitchen, same bathrooms, same worn carpet in the hallway. Where had the money gone? The mortgage payments had increased significantly, according to a comment Daniel made about feeling stretched thin. If they had borrowed more against the house but spent nothing on improvements, the money had gone somewhere else, or to someone else. I added this to my notes, circling it twice. A red flag, not proof of anything yet, but a pattern beginning to emerge. That evening I sat by the window as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The watch still lay on my desk, patient and silent. I would open it soon. But first I needed to understand the full picture. I needed to watch, listen, and wait. I picked up my notebook one last time and turned to a clean page. In careful letters, I wrote a single sentence that would guide everything that followed. We do not confront, we observe. Then I underlined it twice and closed the book. 3 days passed in quiet vigilance. I kept to my routine, tending the garden, reading in the evenings, taking walks along the mountain trails Eleanor and I used to hike together. But underneath the calm exterior, my mind was working constantly, turning over the pieces of a puzzle I did not yet fully understand. I added notes to my notebook each night, small observations, questions without answers, threads that seemed disconnected but felt important. Then on the fourth morning, a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. I watched from the window as an older woman stepped out, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her movements hesitant as she approached the front door. It took me a moment to place her. Margaret Hale. She and Eleanor had been close friends for nearly 20 years, bonded over their shared love of gardening and their volunteer work at the local library. I had not seen Margaret since the funeral. I opened the door before she could knock. Margaret, this is unexpected. She looked at me with eyes that held something between fear and resolve. Richard, I'm sorry to arrive without calling first, but there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. I invited her inside and made tea more out of habit than hospitality. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, but she didn't drink. She stared at the steam rising from the surface as if searching for the right words in its patterns. Eleanor made me promise, she finally said. She made me promise not to say anything unless it became necessary. She believed in giving people chances even when she suspected the worst. But after what I have been hearing lately, I cannot stay silent anymore. What have you been hearing? I asked carefully. Margaret took a deep breath. I ran into Daniel at the grocery store last week. He looked terrible, Richard. Thin, anxious, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. When I asked how you were doing, he changed the subject immediately. And when I mentioned Eleanor's name, Lydia appeared out of nowhere, smiling that smile of hers, and steered him away before he could answer. It reminded me of something Eleanor said years ago, and I knew I had to come see you. She paused, gathering herself. Richard, before Daniel and Lydia got married, Eleanor asked me to help her investigate Lydia's background. She had a feeling, she said. Nothing concrete, just instinct. Eleanor was not the type to interfere in her son's life without reason, so I knew her concern was genuine. My stomach tightened. What did you find? Lydia was married before, 8 years ago in Nevada. His name was Gerald Whitmore. He was 62 years old, a retired businessman, widowed, no children. Lydia was 30 at the time. They met at a charity event and married within 4 months. Margaret's voice dropped lower. The marriage lasted 14 months. During that time, Gerald transferred most of his assets into joint accounts with Lydia. He updated his will to make her the sole beneficiary. And then 3 months after signing over everything, Gerald died in a car accident. Single vehicle, wet road, no witnesses. The words hit me like a physical blow. She killed him. There was never enough evidence to prove anything, Margaret said quietly. The police investigated, but the accident appeared genuine. No signs of tampering, no suspicious circumstances they could identify. Gerald's family had questions, especially his daughter from his first marriage, but without proof there was nothing anyone could do. Lydia inherited everything and moved to Colorado 6 months later. That is where she met Daniel. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing through the implications. This was not simple greed. This was not a woman who married for money and hoped for the best. This was a pattern, a method. Find a vulnerable target, maintain their trust, isolate them from family, transfer the assets, and then wait, or worse. Eleanor documented everything, Margaret continued. She kept a file with all the information we gathered. Newspaper clippings, public records, notes from phone calls she made to people in Nevada who remembered Gerald. She told me that if anything ever happened, you would know where to find it. Where? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She said you would know. She said it was somewhere only you would think to look. The pocket watch. The hidden compartment. Eleanor's words echoed in my memory. Look inside this watch, promise me. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. I'm sorry, Richard. I wanted to tell you before the wedding, but Eleanor insisted on giving Lydia a chance. She hoped she was wrong. She hoped Daniel had found genuine love. But she prepared for the possibility that she was right, I said. Yes, she always prepared. You know that better than anyone. I looked out the window at the mountains, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. My son had married a predator, a woman who had possibly killed before and gotten away with it. And now she was circling me, asking about my finances, probing for weaknesses, scratching the face of my wife's watch like it meant nothing. She has done this before, I whispered. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else. Relief, perhaps, at finally sharing the burden she had carried alone. And your wife knew it. After Margaret left, I sat alone in the silence of my cabin for a long time. The information she had shared changed everything. Lydia was not simply a difficult daughter-in-law with expensive tastes and a dismissive attitude. She was something far more dangerous. A woman with a history of targeting vulnerable men, extracting their wealth, and walking away clean when they were no longer useful. Gerald Whitmore had trusted her, loved her probably, and now he was dead. I could not prove she had killed him. No one could. But the pattern was undeniable, and patterns do not lie. The question now was not whether Lydia posed a threat. The question was how to stop her without becoming her next victim. I called Thomas Reed that afternoon and told him everything Margaret had revealed. He listened without interruption, his silence on the other end of the line heavy with understanding. Eleanor suspected as much, he said when I finished. She never shared the specific details with me, but she made certain preparations that now make complete sense. Richard, we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If Lydia is who you believe she is, she will not stop until she has what she wants. And if she feels cornered, she may become unpredictable. What do you suggest? I asked. We give her exactly what she thinks she wants, Thomas said slowly, but we control the terms. Eleanor used to say that the best way to catch a predator is to let them believe they are the hunter. Over the next week, Thomas and I developed a strategy. He would create a legitimate power of attorney document, but with one crucial modification buried deep in the legal language. The POA would apply only to a single bank account, a new account I would open specifically for this purpose. I transferred $50,000 into it, enough to seem significant enough to tempt someone looking for easy money. The rest of my assets, protected by the arrangements Eleanor had made years ago, would remain untouched and invisible. I didn't have to wait long for Lydia to make her move. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that familiar tone of reluctant obligation. Dad, Lydia and I were talking, and we think it might be a good idea to set up some legal protections. You know, just in case something happens. A power of attorney would let us help manage things if you ever needed it. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. That is very thoughtful of you, son. I suppose at my age it makes sense to plan ahead. Exactly, Daniel said, relief flooding his voice. Lydia knows a lawyer who can draw up the paperwork. It would be quick and simple. Actually, I said carefully, I would prefer to use Thomas Reed. He has handled all my legal matters for years. Eleanor trusted him completely. There was a pause, and I could almost hear Lydia whispering instructions in the background. Sure, Dad. Whatever makes you comfortable. The important thing is getting it done. We arranged to meet at Thomas's office the following Friday. When I arrived, Daniel and Lydia were already seated in the waiting room. Daniel looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone, avoiding my eyes. Lydia, however, was radiant. She smiled warmly as I entered, rising to greet me with a hug that felt rehearsed. Richard, thank you so much for doing this, she said sweetly. It means so much to us knowing that everything is taken care of. Thomas led us into his office and presented the documents with professional neutrality. He explained the terms, clearly, his voice calm and measured. Lydia nodded along, barely glancing at the pages, her attention focused on the signature line at the bottom. She did not notice the specific language limiting the POA to a single designated account. She did not ask questions about the scope or restrictions. She saw only what she wanted to see, a doorway to my finances that she believed would open everything. I picked up the pen Thomas offered and paused for just a moment. Eleanor's voice whispered in my memory a piece of advice she had given me years ago when we were dealing with a dishonest contractor. Give them enough rope to hang themselves. Do not fight them directly. Let them defeat themselves. I signed my name with steady hands. Lydia's smile widened as she watched the pen move across the paper. She reached over and squeezed Daniel's arm, a gesture of triumph disguised as affection. Daniel managed a weak smile in return, still avoiding my gaze. Thank you, Richard, Lydia said, her voice honey smooth. You will not regret this. Thomas collected the documents and nodded professionally. I will file these with the appropriate offices. Everything should be in order within a few days. As we left the office, Lydia walked ahead with Daniel, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. She did not look back. She did not notice the expression on my face or the calm certainty in my step. She had no idea that the document she had just witnessed me sign was not a key to my wealth, but a carefully constructed trap. And she had walked into it with her eyes wide open, smiling all the way. Lydia Cross had learned the value of money before she learned to read. Growing up in a rusted trailer on the outskirts of Reno, she understood poverty not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing presence that shaped every moment of her childhood. Her mother disappeared when Lydia was 6 years old, leaving behind nothing but a closet full of cheap dresses and a note that said simply, "I cannot do this anymore." Her stepfather, a man named Roy, who smelled of whiskey and engine grease, took over her care with the enthusiasm of someone inheriting a debt. He worked odd jobs when he felt like it and collected welfare checks when he did not. The trailer was always cold in winter, always sweltering in summer, and there was never enough food in the refrigerator to quiet the gnawing hunger that became Lydia's constant companion. Roy was not a violent man in the dramatic sense. He never left bruises that teachers might notice or broke bones that would require hospital visits. His cruelty was subtler, more corrosive. He told Lydia daily that she was worthless, that her mother had abandoned her because she was unlovable, that she would amount to nothing and die in the same poverty she was born into. He spent whatever money came into the household on beer and gambling, leaving Lydia to scavenge for meals at school and wear clothes donated by churches. When she was 12, she asked him for $20 to buy supplies for a school project. He laughed in her face and told her that education was a waste of time for girls like her. That night, Lydia made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would never be powerless again. She would never depend on anyone for anything, and she would do whatever it took to escape the cage of poverty that had trapped her mother and was slowly closing around her. By the time she was 18, Lydia had refined her survival strategy. She understood that her beauty was a currency more valuable than any degree or credential. She understood that older men, particularly lonely older men with money and no one to share it with, were the easiest marks. They wanted companionship, attention, the illusion of love. She could provide all of those things, and in return, they would provide the security she had never known. Gerald Whitmore was not her first target, but he was her most successful. She met him at a charity gala in Las Vegas, a 62-year-old widower with sad eyes and a portfolio worth several $1,000,000. He was kind, gentle, desperate for connection after losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. Lydia saw his vulnerability the way a hawk sees a field mouse, with clinical precision and absolute certainty of the outcome. She made herself indispensable to him within weeks. She laughed at his jokes, listened to his stories about his late wife, and slowly isolated him from the few friends and family members who might have warned him. Within 4 months, they were married. Within a year, his assets were in her name. Gerald's death had been convenient. Lydia never thought of it as murder, not exactly. She simply recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. A rainy night, a winding mountain road, a husband who trusted her completely when she suggested one more drink before driving home. She had not pushed him off the cliff. She had merely created the conditions where gravity and alcohol could do their work. The police investigation found nothing suspicious. The insurance company paid out without protest. And Lydia walked away with everything her conscience untouched by guilt. She did not feel remorse for Gerald. He had been weak, trusting easy. In her mind, he had failed the basic test of survival by allowing himself to be manipulated so thoroughly. If he had been smarter, stronger, more suspicious, he might still be alive. His death was not her fault. It was simply the natural consequence of his own naivety. Now, sitting in the passenger seat of Daniel's car as they drove away from Thomas Reed's office, Lydia allowed herself a small smile of triumph. The power of attorney was signed. The door to Richard's finances was open. All that remained was patience and careful execution. She looked out the window at the passing landscape, the mountains rising in the distance, the pine trees thick and green against the gray skies. Richard's cabin was somewhere up there, a property worth at least $500,000 by her estimation, probably more given the land it sat on. Combined with his retirement accounts, investments, and whatever else Eleanor had left behind, Lydia calculated a total worth of at least $2 million, enough to secure her future permanently, enough to never feel the gnawing hunger of poverty again. Richard was more stubborn than Gerald had been, more alert, more cautious. He asked questions instead of simply accepting what he was told. But Lydia had dealt with difficult targets before. The key was patience. The key was making them feel safe until the moment the trap closed around them. Everyone broke eventually. Everyone had a weakness that could be exploited. She just needed to find Richard's. That night, after Daniel fell asleep beside her, Lydia stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. She was 38 years old, still beautiful, still sharp, still hungry. The little girl who had gone to bed starving in a rusted trailer was gone, replaced by a woman who would never allow herself to be vulnerable again. She thought of her mother, whoever she was, wherever she had gone. She thought of Roy, probably dead by now, from liver failure or sheer meanness. She thought of Gerald, his face surprised in the moment before the car left the road. And she thought of Richard sitting alone in his cabin with his precious pocket watch and his memories of a dead wife who could no longer protect him. "He thinks he is clever," Lydia whispered to her reflection, "but he is just another old man with money he does not need. They always underestimate me, and they always regret it." She leaned closer to the mirror, her eyes hard and bright in the fluorescent light. "I will not be powerless again, not ever." 2 weeks after signing the power of attorney, I received the notification I'd been waiting for. My phone buzzed at 7:14 in the morning, an alert from the bank informing me that $47,000 had been transferred out of my account. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee when the message arrived, and I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. $47,000. Not the full $50,000 I had deposited, but close enough to be significant. Lydia had been careful leaving a small balance to avoid triggering automatic account closure. She was testing the waters, I realized, seeing if anyone would notice, seeing if there would be consequences. I called Thomas Reed immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and businesslike despite the early hour. "It happened," I said. "She made her move." "I know," Thomas replied. "I received the same notification. The transfer went to an account in her name only, not the joint account she shares with Daniel. That is important, Richard. It establishes sole intent and eliminates any defense that she was acting on behalf of your son. What happens now? Now we document everything. Wire fraud is a federal offense when the transfer crosses certain thresholds or involves interstate banking systems. This transaction qualifies on both counts. I have already contacted a colleague who specializes in financial crimes. He will preserve the electronic records and create a timeline that cannot be disputed." I took a slow breath, letting the reality settle over me. The trap had worked. Lydia had taken the bait exactly as we had predicted, her greed overriding whatever caution she might have exercised with a more suspicious target. She believed she was dealing with a confused old man who had handed over control of his finances without understanding the implications. She had no idea that every move she made was being recorded, cataloged, and prepared as evidence for her eventual prosecution. "There is something else," Thomas added. "I have been monitoring her internet activity through a contact at the phone company. Legal channels, everything properly authorized. Over the past week, she has been researching guardianship procedures extensively. How to file a petition. What evidence is required to prove mental incompetence, which courts handle such cases in Colorado." My stomach tightened. She is planning to have me declared incompetent. It appears so. The guardianship route would give her complete control over your finances, your property, even your medical decisions. She would become your legal caretaker with authority to manage every aspect of your life. Can she succeed? Not if we act first, but we need to be prepared. She will likely fabricate evidence testimony from people claiming to have witnessed confusion or memory loss. We need to establish a clear record of your mental competence before she has a chance to muddy the waters. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, watching the morning light creep across the cabin floor. The woman my son had married was not simply stealing money. She was preparing to erase me entirely, to reduce me to a legal non-entity with no control over my own existence. The same fate I suspected that had befallen Gerald Whitmore before his convenient accident on that rainy Nevada road. I thought of Eleanor, of her warnings and preparations, of the pocket watch sitting in my desk drawer with its hidden compartment still unopened. She had known this was coming. She had seen Lydia clearly when the rest of us were blinded by politeness and the desire to believe the best in people. And she had left me something, a message or instructions, or perhaps just words of comfort, waiting for the moment when I would finally be ready to receive them. I walked to my desk and retrieved the watch. The scratch Lydia had made across its face caught the light, a permanent reminder of her casual cruelty. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of generations, the history of Eleanor's family pressed into gold and ivory. Then, with careful fingers, I located the small latch that released the back compartment. The mechanism was delicate, designed in an era when craftsmanship meant something more than efficiency. I pressed gently, felt the click of metal against metal, and watched as the back panel swung open on tiny hinges. Inside, folded into a square no larger than a postage stamp, was a piece of paper. The edges were yellowed with age, but the paper itself was thick and sturdy, chosen to last. I recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately, the elegant loops and precise letters she had developed during her years as a bank manager, signing documents that controlled millions of dollars. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. It had been 2 years since I had seen new words from my wife, 2 years since her voice had gone silent and left me alone in a world that felt emptier without her. Whatever this message contained, it was her final gift to me, the last piece of guidance she would ever offer. The first line hit me like a physical blow. "My dearest Richard, if you are reading this, I was right about her." I read Eleanor's letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated the fog of shock that had descended over my mind. Each reading revealed new layers of meaning, new depths of foresight and love that I had never suspected during our 43 years together. My wife had been protecting me long before I knew I needed protection, building walls and laying traps that would only become visible when the danger finally arrived. The letter continued beyond that devastating first line. "I know you will find this hard to believe, and I wish I could be there to explain everything in person. But if you are reading these words, it means I am gone, and Lydia has finally shown her true nature. I want you to understand that I tried to give her a chance. I wanted to be wrong about her. Daniel loves her, or believes he does, and I never wanted to be the mother who destroyed her son's happiness based on suspicion alone. But Richard, some suspicions are too dangerous to ignore." Eleanor explained how she had begun investigating Lydia shortly after Daniel announced their engagement. Something about the relationship had troubled her from the start, a feeling she could not articulate but could not dismiss. The speed of the courtship, the way Lydia seemed to know exactly what to say to win approval, the subtle questions about finances disguised as practical planning. Eleanor had spent 30 years as a bank manager, watching people try to manipulate money and the systems that protected it. She recognized the signs of a predator, even when others saw only charm. "I hired a private investigator," the letter continued. I did not tell you because I knew you would think I was being paranoid. The investigator found Gerald Whitmore within 2 weeks. A 62-year-old widower in Nevada who married a woman named Lydia Cross and died 14 months later in a single-car accident. No charges were ever filed, no evidence of wrongdoing was ever found, but the pattern was unmistakable. She targeted him, isolated him, drained his assets, and then he conveniently died. I believe she killed him, Richard. I cannot prove it, but I believe it with every fiber of my being. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to set the letter down on my desk. Eleanor had known. She had known everything, carried this terrible knowledge alone, and still allowed the wedding to proceed because she could not bear to hurt Daniel without proof. The weight of that sacrifice, the burden of watching her son marry a woman she suspected of murder, must have been unbearable. I picked up the letter again and continued reading. I could not stop the marriage without evidence, but I could prepare for what might come afterward. 3 years ago, I transferred 90% of our assets into an irrevocable trust. The trust is managed by Thomas Reed and cannot be altered by anyone, including you, without meeting specific conditions. Lydia has no legal access to these funds. Daniel is named as a beneficiary, but there is a clause that automatically removes him if financial exploitation of either parent is proven in court. I did this to protect you, Richard, and to protect Daniel from himself because I fear he is too weak to resist her influence. I stopped breathing. 90% of our assets, an irrevocable trust. Eleanor had restructured our entire financial life without telling me, hiding the truth behind routine paperwork and her natural tendency to handle the household accounts. I thought back to the documents she had asked me to sign over the years, estate planning updates and legal forms I had trusted her to understand because she was the expert in such matters. I had signed without reading, closely confident that my wife would never do anything against my interests, and I had been right, though not in the way I expected. Thomas has all the documentation, Eleanor wrote. He knows everything I know about Lydia. He has copies of the investigator's report, the trust documents, and instructions for how to proceed if she ever makes a move against you. I made him promise to wait until you came to him with questions. I did not want to burden you with this knowledge while I was still alive. I wanted us to have peace together whatever time we had left. But if you are reading this letter, the peace is over, and now you must act. The final paragraph blurred as tears filled my eyes. My dearest Richard, do not waste time grieving for me. I have had a beautiful life with you, more happiness than I ever dreamed possible. What I need you to do now is fight. Fight for yourself. Fight for our legacy, and if there is anything left of our son beneath Lydia's influence, fight for him too. You are stronger than you know. You have always been the foundation of our family, steady and unshakable. Do not let her break you. Do not let her win. Call Thomas. He has everything you need. All my love forever. E. I sat motionless for a long time after finishing the letter. The cabin was silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel marking seconds that felt like hours. Eleanor had been gone for 2 years, but in this moment she felt closer than ever, her presence filling the room like sunlight through a window. She had known she was dying. She had known Lydia was dangerous. And instead of spending her final years in fear and anxiety, she had quietly, methodically built a fortress around me that I was only now discovering. I called Thomas Reed with hands that still trembled. "I found the letter," I said when he answered, "the one Eleanor left in the watch." There was a long pause. "I wondered when you would open it. She made me promise to wait until you were ready, until you came to me with questions that meant you already suspected the truth. She said you would find the letter when the time was right." "The trust," I said. "Is it real? Is everything she described actually in place?" "Every word," Thomas confirmed. "The irrevocable trust was established 3 years before Eleanor passed. 90% of your combined assets are protected under terms that Lydia cannot touch and Daniel cannot access if he participates in exploitation. Eleanor also established a separate fund for legal expenses, anticipating that you might need to defend yourself against exactly the kind of attack Lydia is now preparing. Your wife was the most thorough client I have ever worked with. She thought of everything." I looked down at the letter in my hands, at Eleanor's elegant handwriting spelling out love and protection in equal measure. She had given me this gift not from weakness but from strength, not from fear, but from the unshakable certainty that she could protect her family even after death. I had spent 2 years missing her, grieving for the future we would never share. But she had never truly left. She had simply changed form, becoming a shield instead of a presence, a fortress instead of a companion. She knew. I whispered, clutching the letter to my chest. She always knew, and she never stopped protecting me. The trap had been sprung, but the prey did not yet know she was caught. I waited in the days following my discovery of Eleanor's letter, watching from a distance as Lydia's carefully constructed plan began to unravel. Thomas kept me informed of developments through daily phone calls, his network of contacts providing a steady stream of intelligence about her movements and inquiries. What we learned confirmed everything Eleanor had suspected and more. Lydia had expected to find a fortune in the account she drained. $47,000 was a significant sum, but for a woman who had researched my background and calculated my net worth based on property values, retirement accounts, and the lifestyle Eleanor and I had maintained for decades, it was a disappointing haul. She had anticipated millions, she had received pocket change, and the discrepancy drove her to make mistakes she might otherwise have avoided. According to Thomas, Lydia began making inquiries at local banks within days of the transfer. She called financial institutions using Daniel's name and the power of attorney as leverage, attempting to locate other accounts in my name. She found nothing. The accounts existed, of course, but they were held within the irrevocable trust Eleanor had established, invisible to anyone searching for assets under my direct ownership. Lydia was looking for a treasure that had been moved years before she even met my son. The confrontation with Daniel came on a Thursday evening. Thomas had a contact at their cellular provider who flagged unusual call patterns, and the conversation was reconstructed from Daniel's subsequent behavior and the fragments he later admitted during our reconciliation. Lydia had demanded answers he could not provide. Where was the rest of the money? Where had Richard hidden his accounts? Why did the power of attorney only grant access to a single nearly depleted account? Daniel, to his credit, had no answers. He genuinely did not know about Eleanor's trust or the protective structures she had built. He told Lydia the truth as he understood it, that his father was a retired engineer living on pension and savings, that there had never been discussion of hidden wealth or complex financial arrangements. Lydia didn't believe him. She accused him of keeping secrets, of siding with his father against his own wife. The argument lasted for hours, and by the end something had shifted between them. Daniel had seen a glimpse of the woman beneath the mask, and the sight had disturbed him. I learned of Lydia's next move through official channels. A process server arrived at my cabin on a Monday morning, delivering a formal summons to appear in court. The document was dense with legal language, but the core allegation was simple enough. Lydia had filed a petition for emergency guardianship, claiming that I was suffering from cognitive decline, memory loss, and an inability to manage my own affairs. She cited specific incidents, some fabricated entirely, others twisted versions of ordinary moments. She claimed I had forgotten her name at the dinner where she scratched my watch. She claimed I had become confused about basic financial matters, signing documents without understanding their contents. She claimed I posed a danger to myself and required immediate intervention for my own protection. The irony was almost elegant. The document I had signed with full understanding and careful intention was now being used as evidence of my supposed incompetence. Lydia was attempting to weaponize my own trap against me, unaware that every element of her strategy had been anticipated years in advance. I read the summons twice, then set it on my desk and smiled. This was exactly what Eleanor had predicted. This was the escalation we had prepared for. Lydia had overplayed her hand, moving from financial exploitation to a direct assault on my autonomy and dignity. She wanted to erase me, to reduce me to a legal non-entity under her complete control. And in doing so, she had exposed herself to scrutiny she could not withstand. I called Thomas immediately. She filed for guardianship, I said. Emergency petition. She claims I am mentally incompetent. I received a copy of the filing an hour ago, Thomas replied. She is moving faster than I anticipated. The hearing is scheduled for next week. Can she win? Not a chance, but she does not know that yet. She believes she is dealing with an elderly man who has no resources, no allies, and no understanding of the legal system. She has no idea what Eleanor prepared or what documentation we possess. When she walks into that courtroom, she will be expecting an easy victory. She will find something very different. I thought about Daniel, about the doubt that must be growing in his mind after Lydia's accusations and demands. My son was weak, but he was not evil. He had been manipulated by a woman far more skilled in deception than he could recognize. Part of me wanted to reach out to him to warn him about what was coming. But I knew that any contact now would only give Lydia ammunition. She would claim I was attempting to interfere to manipulate my son against his own wife. Better to let the legal process reveal the truth in its own time. There is something else, Thomas added. My contact at the phone company flagged an interesting search pattern on Lydia's devices. Before filing the guardianship petition, she researched extensively about how such cases are decided. She knows that a medical evaluation will be required. She has already contacted a doctor in Denver, someone with a reputation for providing favorable assessments in exchange for generous fees. She is trying to stack the deck. Then we need to stack it first, I said. I want an independent evaluation from a physician of our choosing, someone with impeccable credentials who cannot be bought or pressured. I want the assessment completed before her hired expert has a chance to muddy the waters. Already arranged, Thomas said. Dr. Elaine Carter, a clinical psychologist with 30 years of experience and a reputation for absolute integrity. She has agreed to conduct a comprehensive evaluation tomorrow morning. Her report will be filed with the court before Lydia even knows we are fighting back. I looked out the window at the mountains, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun. Eleanor had given me weapons I never knew existed. Thomas had sharpened them to a fine edge. And now Lydia, in her arrogance and greed, had walked directly into the path of a counterattack she could not imagine. She wants to declare me incompetent, I told Thomas calmly. Then let's prove her spectacularly wrong. Elaine Carter's office was located in a professional building on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, a quiet space with neutral colors and comfortable furniture designed to put patients at ease. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a clean button-down shirt and pressed slacks the same way I would have dressed for any important business meeting during my working years. First impressions mattered even in medical settings, perhaps especially in medical settings where someone was attempting to prove you had lost your mind. Dr. Carter greeted me in the waiting room herself, a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to absorb information with every glance. She had a firm handshake and a direct manner that I appreciated immediately. There was no condescension in her voice, no hint of the patronizing tone that some professionals adopted when speaking with older patients. "Mr. Lawson, thank you for coming in on such short notice," she said, leading me to her office. Thomas Reed explained the situation. "I want you to know that my evaluation will be completely objective. I have no interest in the legal proceedings beyond providing an accurate assessment of your cognitive function." "That is exactly what I want," I replied. "An honest evaluation. If something is wrong with my mind, I would rather know the truth than live in denial." She smiled slightly. That attitude alone suggests a level of self-awareness that many people never achieve. Let us begin. The evaluation lasted 90 minutes and covered every aspect of mental function I could imagine. Dr. Carter tested my memory with lists of words I had to recall after various intervals. She assessed my logical reasoning with puzzles and pattern recognition exercises. She asked me to draw a clock face showing a specific time, a simple task that apparently revealed a great deal about spatial awareness and cognitive organization. She questioned me about my daily routines, my ability to manage household tasks, my understanding of my own finances and legal affairs. I answered everything honestly without embellishment or false modesty. When she asked about my background, I explained my 40 years as a structural engineer, the complex calculations and precise measurements that had defined my professional life. When she inquired about my current activities, I described my garden, my reading habits, the detailed notebook where I documented observations and tracked expenses. I showed her photographs on my phone of the cabin repairs I had completed single-handedly over the past year. I walked her through the logic of the trap I had set for Lydia, the careful planning and legal coordination that had led to this moment. By the end of the evaluation, Dr. Carter set down her pen and looked at me with something approaching admiration. "Mr. Lawson, I have conducted hundreds of competency evaluations over the past 30 years. I can tell you without hesitation that you are sharper than most people half your age. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is clear and sophisticated, and your ability to manage complex tasks is well above average. There is no evidence of cognitive impairment whatsoever. Whoever filed this guardianship petition either has no understanding of mental competence or is acting in bad faith." I thanked her and shook her hand, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I had not realized I was carrying. The evaluation had been thorough and fair, exactly what I needed to counter Lydia's fabricated claims. The preliminary court hearing took place 5 days later in a small courtroom in downtown Colorado Springs. Thomas Reed sat beside me at the respondent's table, his briefcase filled with documentation we had prepared over the preceding weeks. Across the aisle, Lydia sat with her attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone, as if expecting more important matters to demand his attention. Daniel sat in the gallery behind them, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morrison, known according to Thomas for her no-nonsense approach and low tolerance for frivolous litigation. She reviewed the petition, Dr. Carter's evaluation, and the supporting documentation we had submitted without expression. "Counsel for the petitioner," Judge Morrison said, looking at Lydia's attorney. "This evaluation from Dr. Elaine Carter indicates that the respondent demonstrates no cognitive impairment and functions at a level well above average for his age group. Do you have any evidence to contradict these findings?" The attorney stood shuffling papers nervously. "Your Honor, our client has observed numerous instances of confusion and memory loss. The respondent has difficulty remembering names, has made questionable financial decisions, and has shown signs of paranoid thinking regarding family members." "Observations from the petitioner are not medical evidence," Judge Morrison replied flatly. "Do you have an independent evaluation, medical records testimony from healthcare providers?" "We had arranged for an evaluation, Your Honor, but the respondent's attorney scheduled this hearing before it could be completed. An evaluation that was not disclosed to the court or opposing counsel." Thomas interjected calmly. "We have reason to believe the physician in question has a history of providing favorable assessments for payment. We would be happy to provide documentation of his disciplinary record if the court is interested." Judge Morrison held up her hand. "That will not be necessary. I have seen enough." She turned to Lydia, who had gone rigid in her seat. "Mrs. Lawson, filing a guardianship petition is a serious matter. It requires substantial evidence of incapacity, not personal grievances or financial motivations. Based on the documentation before me, I find no credible evidence that Richard Lawson is unable to manage his own affairs. This petition is dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Lydia was on her feet before the sound faded, her face flushed with fury. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit without looking at her attorney, without looking at Daniel, without looking at me. The courtroom door slammed behind her with a force that made the bailiff frown. I remained seated, letting the moment settle. Thomas gathered his papers with quiet efficiency, nodding to me with the faintest hint of a smile. Across the aisle, Daniel had not moved. He sat frozen in the gallery, staring at the empty space where his wife had been, his expression shifting through emotions I could not fully read. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was warm on my face. I paused on the steps to breathe the fresh air, to appreciate the simple victory of being declared competent to manage my own life. Thomas excused himself to make phone calls, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Daniel approaching. He looked older than his 41 years, his shoulders hunched, his eyes red-rimmed as if he had not slept in days. He stopped a few feet away, unable to meet my gaze directly. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "I think I've made a terrible mistake." We drove to my cabin in separate cars, Daniel following behind me in his sedan, with the caution of a man who was not certain he wanted to reach his destination. I watched him in my rearview mirror, noting the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, the tension visible even from a distance. My son was at a crossroads, and the path he chose in the coming hours would determine whether our relationship could be salvaged or whether Lydia had destroyed it beyond repair. The cabin was quiet when we arrived, the afternoon light filtering through the windows in golden streams that reminded me of Eleanor. I made coffee, without asking if Daniel wanted any, needing the familiar ritual to steady my own nerves. When I returned to the living room, he was standing by the fireplace staring at a photograph of his mother that had hung there for 20 years. "She always knew things," Daniel said softly, not turning around. "Mom had this way of seeing through people. I used to think it was annoying how she would warn me about friends who turned out to be exactly what she said they were. I stopped listening after a while. I thought I knew better. I knew." I set the coffee cups on the table and waited. This conversation could not be rushed. Daniel needed to arrive at the truth in his own time, through his own process. If I pushed too hard, he would retreat into defensiveness. If If I said too little, he might convince himself that the problems in his marriage were ordinary, fixable, unrelated to the woman Lydia truly was. "Sit down, son," I said gently. "There are things you need to see." I had prepared a folder containing everything relevant to Lydia's history and her actions against me. The wire transfer records showing the $47,000 she had stolen using the power of attorney. The investigators' report on Gerald Whitmore, including newspaper clippings about his death and the timeline of his brief marriage to a woman named Lydia Cross. Eleanor's letter photocopied so the original could remain safe. The trust documents proving that Eleanor had anticipated this threat years before it materialized. Daniel sat on the couch and accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly. He opened it slowly as if the papers inside might bite him. I watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his cheeks as the evidence accumulated. He paused longest on the Gerald Whitmore material, reading the same paragraphs multiple times, as if repetition might change their meaning. "This cannot be right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She loves me. We have been married for 7 years. I would know if she was capable of something like this." "Would you?" I asked quietly. "Daniel, I am not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at what is documented. Bank records do not lie. Court filings do not lie. Your mother investigated Lydia before you married her and found a dead husband whose assets vanished into his young wife's accounts 3 months before a convenient accident. Eleanor did not tell you because she hoped she was wrong. She hoped Lydia would change, would become the woman you believed her to be. But she prepared for the possibility that she was right." Daniel shook his head, still clutching the Gerald Whitmore file. "Mom never said anything. Not once in 7 years did she warn me about Lydia. Because she loved you. Because she wanted you to be happy. And because she knew that warning you without proof would only drive you away." I leaned forward, holding my son's gaze. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your wife. I'm asking you to look at what is true. Look at how Lydia reacted when the guardianship petition failed. Look at how she stormed out of that courtroom without a word to you. Ask yourself whether an innocent woman, a loving wife, would behave that way when her husband's father was proven mentally competent." The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of distance and missed opportunities for honest conversation. Daniel had always been conflict avoidant, a trait he inherited from neither Eleanor nor me. He preferred peace at any price, harmony maintained through surrender. Lydia had exploited that tendency ruthlessly, shaping him into a compliant partner who questioned nothing and defended everything she did. "There is something else you should know," I said carefully. "Colorado is a one-party consent state. That means if you are part of a conversation, you can legally record it without the other person's knowledge or permission. If you ever need to know what someone really thinks of you, what they say when they believe no one is listening, you have that option." Daniel looked up sharply, understanding flickering in his eyes. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. The suggestion had been planted, and what he did with it was his choice. I could not force my son to see his wife clearly. I could only provide him with the tools to discover the truth for himself. He stood abruptly still, holding the folder. "I need to go. I need to think about all of this." "Take your time," I said, rising with him. "I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready to talk, I will be here." Daniel walked to the door without another word, his shoulders rigid with tension. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, and for a moment I thought he might turn around and say something meaningful. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing, and stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. I watched from the window as he got into his car and sat motionless behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine immediately. Through the windshield, I could see him staring at his phone, scrolling through something with the intensity of a man searching for answers in a device that could not provide them. Minutes passed. 5, then 10. Finally, he set the phone down and drove away, his taillights disappearing around the bend in the road. I returned to the living room to collect the coffee cups and found that the folder I had prepared was incomplete. The wire transfer records were there. Eleanor's letter was there. The trust documents were there. But the Gerald Whitmore file, the newspaper clippings and investigators' notes about Lydia's first husband, was gone. Daniel had taken it with him. He had not said goodbye. He had not promised to call. He had not defended his wife or accused me of lying, but he had taken the evidence of Lydia's past, the documentation of a dead man whose marriage had followed the same pattern now threatening to repeat itself. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation, but it was something. A crack in the wall Lydia had built around my son, a sliver of doubt that might, with time and courage, grow into the clarity he needed to save himself. 2 weeks passed without word from Daniel. I didn't call him. I didn't send messages or drive past his house or attempt any form of contact that might be perceived as pressure. My son needed time to process what he had learned, to reconcile the woman he had married with the evidence I had placed in his hands. Pushing him would only backfire. Trust once damaged could only be rebuilt through patience and the slow accumulation of choices freely made. I spent those 2 weeks preparing for whatever came next. Thomas Reed and I reviewed every document, every timeline, every piece of evidence we had gathered. We consulted with a colleague who specialized in federal financial crimes, ensuring that our case against Lydia would withstand scrutiny from any angle. The wire fraud charges alone carried serious penalties, but Thomas believed we could build something more comprehensive, a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years and crossing state lines. On the 15th day, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen and I answered immediately. "Dad," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. "Can I come over? I have something you need to hear." He arrived an hour later looking like a man who had not slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes carrying the hollow exhaustion of someone who had witnessed the destruction of everything he believed to be true. He carried a small digital recorder in his hands, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. We sat in the living room, the same space where I had shown him the evidence 2 weeks earlier. Daniel placed the recorder on the coffee table between us and stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "After I left here, I went home and confronted Lydia about Gerald Whitmore," he said slowly. "She denied everything at first, said the investigator's report was fabricated, that you had manufactured evidence to turn me against her. I wanted to believe her. Part of me still loved her, still hoped there was an explanation that would make everything okay." He paused, swallowing hard. But something had changed. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored for years. The way she talked about money, the way she dismissed your feelings, your dignity, your right to make your own decisions. The way she looked at your cabin like it was already hers. And I remembered what you said about Colorado being a one-party consent state. Daniel pressed a button on the recorder. The sound that emerged was slightly muffled but clear enough to understand. Lydia's voice filled the room, sharp with frustration. "The guardianship should have worked," she said on the recording. "That judge was supposed to see a confused old man who needed supervision. Instead, your father showed up with lawyers and medical reports like he had been planning this for months. Someone warned him. Someone told him what was coming." Daniel's voice responded, carefully neutral. "Maybe he's just smarter than we thought." Lydia laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Smart. Your father is just an old fool sitting on money he does not need. He is going to die in a few years anyway. Why should we wait for nature to take its course when we could be enjoying that inheritance now?" There was a pause on the recording, then Daniel asked quietly, "Have you done this before? Gone after someone's money like this?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Lydia answered, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Gerald was easy. He was lonely, desperate for companionship, willing to believe anything I told him. Your father is more stubborn. He asks too many questions, pays too much attention. But everyone breaks eventually. Daniel, everyone has a weakness that can be exploited." "What happened to Gerald?" Daniel asked on the recording. "The file said he died in a car accident." Lydia's response made my blood run cold. Accidents happen when people become inconvenient. Gerald served his purpose, and then he became a liability. Your father is heading in the same direction. When he dies, everything becomes ours. We just have to wait, or we could speed things up if you have the stomach for it. The recording ended. Daniel reached over and stopped the device, his hands trembling visibly. "There is more," he said, his voice breaking. "Hours of conversations where she talks about you like you are an obstacle to be removed. She mentioned forging your signature on documents. She talked about finding a doctor who would declare you incompetent for the right price. She even discussed what would happen if you had an accident like Gerald." I sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of what my son had done slowly dawning on me. He had lived with a potential murderer for 2 weeks, pretending everything was normal, while secretly gathering evidence that would destroy her. He had listened to his wife discuss his father's death as a business strategy and maintained his composure well enough to ask follow-up questions. The courage that required was beyond anything I would have expected from the conflict-avoidant boy I had raised. "Dad," Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. "I was weak. I was blind. I let her manipulate me for 7 years because I was too afraid of conflict to see what was right in front of me. But I will not be complicit in this, not anymore. This is everything she said when she thought I was on her side. I am giving it to you because you deserve justice and because Mom would have wanted me to do the right thing even when it was hard." I stood and crossed the space between us. My son rose to meet me, and for the first time in years we embraced. I held him tightly, feeling the shudders that ran through his body as the weight of his betrayal and his redemption crashed together. "I'm proud of you, son," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "This took courage, more courage than you know." Daniel pulled back, wiping his eyes. "What do we do now?" I looked at the recorder on the table, at the evidence that would finally bring Lydia's predatory career to an end. Eleanor had prepared the foundation, Thomas had built the legal framework, Daniel had provided the final damning proof. All the pieces were in place. "Now," I said, my voice steady as steel, "we end this together." The legal machinery moved with a precision that would have impressed Eleanor Tor. Thomas Reed filed the civil lawsuit 3 days after Daniel delivered the recordings naming Lydia as defendant in charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, and forgery. The documentation was overwhelming. Bank records showing the unauthorized transfer of $47,000, the power of attorney she had manipulated Daniel into requesting. Evidence of her research into guardianship procedures designed to strip me of my autonomy. And beneath it all, the recordings where she discussed my potential death as casually as one might discuss the weather. Simultaneously, Thomas reported the wire fraud to federal authorities. The transfer had crossed state lines through the banking system, elevating what might have been a local matter into federal jurisdiction. An FBI agent named Morrison contacted Thomas within 48 hours, expressing significant interest in the case. The Gerald Whitmore connection, once established, transformed Lydia from a common thief into a potential serial predator whose activities spanned multiple states and possibly included homicide. Lydia was served papers at her home on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel had already moved out, taking only his personal belongings and leaving behind the life they had built together. He was staying in a small apartment across town, rebuilding himself one day at a time with the quiet determination of a man who had finally awakened from a long nightmare. I offered to let him stay at the cabin, but he declined. He needed to stand on his own, he said. He needed to prove to himself that he could survive without leaning on anyone else. I was not present when the process server arrived at Lydia's door, but Thomas received a detailed account from his contacts in the sheriff's department. She had answered the door in expensive loungewear, her hair perfectly styled, her expression shifting from confusion to fury as she realized what the documents represented. She refused to accept them initially, forcing the server to leave them on her doorstep as legally permitted. Then she called Thomas's office, demanding to speak with him directly. Thomas put her on speakerphone so I could listen. "This is ridiculous," Lydia said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Daniel is behind this. He has been acting strange for weeks, recording conversations without my knowledge, twisting my words to make me look bad. Whatever he told you, whatever supposed evidence he provided, it is all manipulation." "The bank records are not manipulation," Thomas replied calmly. "The wire transfer documentation is not manipulation, and the recordings speak for themselves, Mrs. Lawson. Your own voice discussing your father-in-law's potential death as a business opportunity." Those recordings were edited, taken out of context. I was venting frustration, not planning anything criminal. "You mentioned Gerald Whitmore by name. You described him as easy. You referenced his death as something that happened when he became inconvenient. Would you like me to play that section for the federal investigators who are now reviewing your case?" The line went silent. When Lydia spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming smaller, more desperate. "You do not understand. None of you understand what I have been through. I grew up with nothing. My mother abandoned me. My stepfather treated me like garbage. I had to fight for every single thing I ever had. You cannot judge me for trying to survive." "Survival does not require stealing from elderly men," Thomas said. "It does not require planning their deaths, and it does not require marrying into families with the sole intention of draining their assets. The court will determine appropriate judgment. I suggest you retain competent legal counsel." He ended the call. The formal confrontation came 2 weeks later at a preliminary hearing where both parties were required to appear. Lydia arrived with an attorney I did not recognize, a nervous young man who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case against his client. I sat with Thomas and Daniel, the three of us presenting a united front that clearly unnerved her. When the judge called a brief recess, Lydia approached me in the hallway. Her composure had cracked significantly since the phone call. Her makeup was slightly smudged. Her hands trembled at her sides, and her eyes held the wild desperation of a cornered animal. "You planned this," she hissed. "You and that dead wife of yours. You set a trap and waited for me to walk into it." "Eleanor prepared for possibilities," I replied evenly. "You chose to make them reality." Something broke behind her eyes. The carefully constructed mask she had worn for years shattered completely, revealing the frightened, furious child beneath. "You do not understand what I went through," she screamed loud enough that heads turned throughout the corridors. "I had to survive. I had to protect myself because no one else would. You sit there in your comfortable cabin with your comfortable life and judge me for doing what I had to do." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. I'd read the file on Gerald Whitmore. I had heard her discuss my death as an inconvenience to be scheduled. Whatever trauma had shaped her, she had chosen to become a predator rather than seek healing. "You never saw me," Lydia screamed, her voice cracking. "You never tried to understand." I looked at her steadily, my voice calm against her storm of emotion. "I saw exactly who you are. That is the problem." Lydia's attorney requested a meeting 3 days after the hallway confrontation. He claimed his client wanted to discuss a potential settlement, an opportunity to resolve matters without the expense and publicity of a prolonged trial. Thomas was skeptical, but I agreed to hear what she had to say. Not because I believed she had anything meaningful to offer, but because I wanted closure. I wanted to look Lydia in the eye one final time and say the things that needed to be said. We met in Thomas's conference room, a space designed for exactly these kinds of difficult conversations. The walls were lined with legal books, the table polished to a mirror shine, and cameras recorded everything from multiple angles. Thomas sat beside me, a legal pad ready for notes. Lydia's attorney sat across from us looking uncomfortable, and Lydia herself occupied the chair at the far end of the table, her appearance markedly different from the polished woman I had known for 7 years. She looked diminished, somehow smaller than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup minimal, her clothing chosen for modesty rather than impression. Whether this transformation was genuine or calculated, I could not tell. With Lydia, every gesture carried the possibility of manipulation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." She began, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I know I do not deserve your time or your attention, but I wanted a chance to explain, to help you understand why I became the person I am." I said nothing. I simply waited. Lydia took a deep breath and began speaking about her childhood. She described the trailer where she grew up, the poverty that shaped her earliest memories, the mother who abandoned her without explanation. She spoke about Roy, her stepfather, the daily humiliations and casual cruelties that taught her the world was a hostile place where only the ruthless survived. Her voice cracked as she recounted nights spent hungry because Roy had spent the grocery money on alcohol, mornings spent hiding bruises beneath long sleeves so teachers would not ask questions. "I learned that no one would protect me," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I learned that the only person I could rely on was myself. Money meant safety. Control meant survival. I did terrible things, I know that now, but I was trying to escape a life that would have destroyed me. Can you not understand that? Can you not see that I was a victim too?" She looked at me with an expression of desperate hope, waiting for the sympathy she believed her story deserved. I let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding. "I understand more than you realize," I said quietly. "My father was a drunk. He spent every paycheck at the bar while my mother worked double shifts to keep food on the table. We wore secondhand clothes and lived in apartments where the heat rarely worked in winter. I know what it feels like to go to bed hungry, Lydia. I know what it feels like to wonder whether the adults in your life will protect you or fail you." Her expression shifted, surprise flickering through the calculated vulnerability. "But here's the difference between us," I continued. "I chose to build. When I escaped poverty, I built a career. I built a family. I built a life based on creating things that would last, structures that would shelter people and keep them safe. You chose to destroy. You took the pain you experienced and used it as justification for inflicting pain on others. Gerald Whitmore did not abuse you. He loved you, and you exploited that love until he was no longer useful. I did not abuse you. I welcomed you into my family, and you repaid that welcome with theft and manipulation and plans for my death. Lydia opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. Pain explains behavior. It does not excuse it. Your stepfather was cruel to you, and that cruelty shaped who you became. But you had choices, Lydia. Every single day you had the choice to become something different. You chose not to. That decision was yours, not Roy's, not your mother's, yours. I thought of Eleanor, of the hope she had carried despite her suspicions, the chance she had given this woman to prove her wrong. My wife saw what you were before anyone else did. She investigated your past, found the evidence of what you had done to Gerald Whitmore, prepared protections against the threat you posed. But she still hoped you would change. She gave you 7 years to become the woman Daniel believed you to be. You wasted that chance. You took her generosity and her patience and her love for her son, and you threw it all away because you could not stop being what you are. That is on you, no one else. Lydia was crying now, tears streaming down her face in a display of emotion that might have been genuine or might have been one final attempt at manipulation. I realized I did not care which it was. The truth had been spoken. The lesson had been delivered. Whatever Lydia felt in this moment, whatever regret or sorrow or self-pity moved through her heart, it changed nothing. I stood and gathered my jacket from the back of my chair. Thomas rose with me, understanding that the meeting was over. I walked to the door, then paused with my hand on the frame. I turned back to look at Lydia one final time, at the woman who had caused so much damage to my family, my son, my peace of mind. I forgive you, Lydia, I said. But forgiveness does not mean no consequences. I left without looking back. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 1 week after my final meeting with Lydia. Thomas Reed's voice carried an unusual tension when I answered, a controlled excitement that told me something significant had occurred. Richard, I need you to come to my office this afternoon. There is someone here you need to meet, someone who has been waiting 6 years for this moment. I arrived at 2 o'clock to find Thomas in his conference room with a woman I had never seen before. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with auburn hair streaked with gray and eyes that carried the weight of long-held grief. She stood when I entered, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, and I noticed she was holding a thick manila folder, similar to the one Eleanor had compiled years ago. Richard Lawson, Thomas said, this is Sarah Whitmore, Gerald Whitmore's daughter. The name hit me like a physical blow. Gerald Whitmore, the man Lydia had married 8 years ago in Nevada. The man who had died in a convenient car accident 3 months after signing over his assets. I had read about him in Eleanor's files, studied the newspaper clippings and investigators' notes, but he had always been an abstraction, a cautionary tale from Lydia's past. Now his daughter stood before me, flesh and blood proof that the damage Lydia caused extended far beyond my own family. Thank you for seeing me, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. I saw the news coverage of the charges against Lydia. When I heard the details, the financial manipulation, the elderly victim, the pattern of control and exploitation, I knew I had to come forward. I have been waiting 6 years for someone to stop her. We sat down, and Sarah began to tell her story. Her father had been a successful businessman, retired early after selling his company comfortable and secure in his late 50s. Her mother had died of cancer when Sarah was in college, and Gerald had spent years grieving before finally deciding he was ready to find companionship again. He met Lydia at a charity event in Las Vegas, a beautiful young woman who seemed genuinely interested in his stories and his life. I was working overseas when they got engaged, Sarah said. I flew back for the wedding and met her for the first time. Something felt wrong immediately. She was too perfect, too attentive, too eager to please. But my father was happier than I had seen him since my mother died. I did not want to ruin that with suspicions I could not prove. The marriage lasted 14 months. During that time, Sarah watched from a distance as her father's behavior changed. He became isolated, seeing less of his friends and family, making excuses for why Sarah could not visit as often as she wanted. His phone calls grew shorter, more guarded, as if someone were listening. And then the financial changes began. He updated his will 3 months before he died. Sarah said, opening her folder to reveal a stack of documents. He changed the beneficiary on his life insurance. He added Lydia to all his accounts and removed me from the deed to his house. When I asked him about it, he said Lydia thought it was important for estate planning purposes. He sounded like he was reciting lines someone had written for him. She pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. I found this in his belongings after he died. The entries from his last months are terrifying. He wrote about feeling trapped about Lydia's mood swings, about arguments where she threatened to leave him with nothing if he did not comply with her demands. He was afraid of her, but he did not know how to escape. Sarah showed me emails between Gerald and Lydia messages where she pressured him to update documents, make transfers, sign papers he did not fully understand. She showed me the insurance claim filed 3 days after his death, processed with unusual speed, the payout deposited into an account bearing only Lydia's name. The police ruled it an accident, Sarah said bitterly. Single car, wet road, no witnesses. But my father drove that mountain road hundreds of times. He knew every curve, every dangerous spot. He would never have lost control unless something else was happening in that car. Thomas leaned forward. Sarah has agreed to share all of this with the authorities in Nevada. Based on the new evidence and the pattern established by the current charges, the district attorney has agreed to reopen the investigation into Gerald Whitmore's death. I looked at Sarah at the grief and hope warring in her expression and felt a connection that transcended our different circumstances. We had both loved someone targeted by Lydia. We had both suffered the consequences of her predatory nature. But where I had been fortunate enough to have Eleanor's protection and the resources to fight back, Sarah had been left alone with nothing but suspicions and a father's grave. "You stopped her," Sarah said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You did what I could not. Because of you, she will face justice. Because of you, my father's death might finally be investigated properly." I reached across the table and took her hand. Eleanor deserves the credit. She saw the truth when no one else did. She prepared for this moment years before it arrived. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "Then thank Eleanor for me. Thank her for giving me hope after 6 years of feeling helpless." We sat in silence for a moment, two strangers united by a common enemy and the long-delayed promise of justice. "She is not just a thief," Sarah said quietly. "She might be a murderer, and now finally someone will investigate." The trials concluded 6 months later, and justice arrived with the weight and permanence I had hoped for, but never quite believed possible. Lydia stood before a federal judge in Denver and heard her sentence delivered in words that would define the rest of her life. Wire fraud, 8 to 12 years in federal prison. The evidence had been overwhelming. The recordings Daniel provided playing in the courtroom while Lydia sat motionless, her carefully constructed mask finally shattered beyond repair. The state charges followed immediately after: elder financial abuse, an additional 2 to 4 years to be served consecutively. The judge cited the premeditated nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of her intended victim, and the pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back years before she ever entered my life. In Nevada, the Gerald Whitmore case was officially reopened. Sarah Whitmore's evidence, combined with the pattern established by Lydia's conviction in Colorado, gave investigators new grounds to examine her father's death. The outcome remained uncertain, justice still unfolding in its own time. But Sarah called me the day the investigation was announced. She was crying, but they were tears of relief rather than grief. After 6 years of feeling helpless, she finally had hope that her father's memory would receive the truth it deserved. Lydia's world collapsed completely in the weeks following her sentencing. Her family in Nevada, distant relatives she had rarely mentioned publicly, disavowed any connection to her. Friends she had cultivated over years of careful social climbing vanished as if they had never existed. The community that had once welcomed her into charity events and social gatherings now spoke her name only in whispers of disgust. She was ordered to pay full restitution, every dollar she had stolen returned to the accounts she had violated. When she finally entered federal custody, she did so utterly alone, abandoned by everyone who had once believed her performance of charm and warmth. Daniel's journey proved more complicated, but ultimately more hopeful. The divorce was finalized 3 months after Lydia's arrest, a simple proceeding, given that she was in no position to contest anything. He lost the house which had been leveraged with debt Lydia had accumulated without his knowledge, and found himself starting over at 41 with nothing but the clothes in his closet and the lessons he had learned too late. He came to the cabin on a Sunday afternoon, standing on my porch with his hands in his pockets and his eyes filled with the shame of a man who understood exactly how badly he had failed. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I know that. I enabled her for 7 years. I ignored every warning sign because I was too afraid of conflict to face the truth. Mom tried to protect me, and I married the woman she warned me about. You tried to protect me, and I let Lydia file guardianship papers against you." I listened without interrupting, letting him say what he needed to say. "But I want you to know that I will spend whatever time I have left earning back your trust, not because I expect you to forget what happened, but because you are my father, and I love you. And I should have said that years ago when it might have made a difference." I looked at my son, at the man he was trying to become after so many years of being less than he could be. The anger I had carried for months had faded, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of love and caution that would take time to resolve. "You can visit," I said finally. "You are still my son, and nothing will ever change that. But trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. We start over slowly. We see where the path leads." Daniel nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. He rented a small apartment in town and found work at a construction company, honest labor that paid modestly but demanded integrity. I saw him every few weeks, brief visits that gradually grew longer as the months passed. We were not healed, not yet, but we were healing. On a cool evening in late autumn, I took Eleanor's pocket watch to a master craftsman in Colorado Springs. He examined the scratches on the face, the damaged clasp, the worn mechanism that had kept time faithfully for over a century. "Battle damage?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I smiled. "Battle scars, but it still keeps perfect time." He repaired the watch with the care it deserved, restoring the clasp and polishing the case until it gleamed like it had on the day Eleanor first placed it in my hands. When he returned it to me, I held it for a long moment, feeling the familiar weight against my palm. That evening, I sat on my cabin porch and watched the sun descend behind the mountains. The sky blazed with colors. Eleanor would have loved oranges and purples and deep reds that seemed to set the world on fire before fading into peaceful darkness. Her letter rested in my breast pocket, close to my heart where it would remain. The repaired watch ticked steadily in my hand, faithful and patient and enduring. I opened the watch one more time, reading Eleanor's words in the fading light. "Do not grieve. Act." I closed it gently and whispered to the evening sky, "I did, sweetheart. I did." The watch ticked steadily against my palm, faithful, patient, enduring. Just like the woman who had given it to me, just like the love that outlasted death itself. And that is where Richard's story ends. But the lessons it teaches will stay with me for a long time. What strikes me most about this story is not the revenge itself, but the quiet strength it took to achieve it. Richard did not scream or threaten or act out of anger. He observed, he documented, he prepared, and he waited for the truth to reveal itself. That patience, that discipline is something we can all learn from. Eleanor's love reached beyond the grave to protect her husband, and that reminds us that the people who truly love us will find ways to shield us even when they are no longer by our side. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Do not let politeness or the desire to keep peace blind you to red flags. Document everything. Keep records, save messages, write things down. You never know when evidence will become your greatest protection. And most importantly, remember that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. You can be generous and loving and forgiving while still protecting yourself from those who would take advantage of your good heart. To everyone watching, especially those of you who have experienced betrayal from people you trusted, know that your dignity matters, your peace matters, and it is never too late to stand up for yourself. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I will see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves, and remember, respect once broken is never cheap to replace.